She's just my secretary, Richard said, waving his hand toward me like I was furniture in the room. 6 lawyers nodded. Nobody noticed the acquisition documents on the table already had my name printed on page 1, in a place none of them had thought to read carefully yet. In 11 days, the $30 million buyout would collapse entirely, without my signature. And Richard had no idea why, but to understand how the man I'd worked for, 12 years could stand in a room and erase me completely. You need to know something Richard himself didn't know. Something I'd spent 12 years quietly making sure he never found out. My name is Claire Bennett. I want to tell you honestly, from the very beginning, that I did not walk into Halverson Group 12 years ago as an ordinary job applicant looking for administrative work. I walked in with a name I'd legally changed 3 years earlier, a resume carefully built to look unremarkable, and a piece of family history that Richard Halverson's father had spent 30 years making sure nobody would ever trace back to me. My birth name was Claire Whitfield. My father, Edmund Whitfield, co-founded what eventually became Halverson Group in a 2-room office with Richard's father, Arthur Halverson, back when it was still called Whitfield Halverson Logistics. 2 names, equal partners, equal shares. That's how it started. That's not how it ended. I was 11 years old when my father lost the company. I didn't understand the details then. I only understood that my father, who used to come home laughing about the client wins of the day, came home one evening in complete silence and didn't speak at dinner for a week. It took me years, well into adulthood, going through his old files after he passed, to understand what had actually happened. Arthur Halverson had orchestrated a slow, deliberate freeze-out. A manufactured cash flow crisis my father wasn't told the full truth about. A forced buyout of his shares at a valuation Arthur controlled entirely, timed during a period when my father was recovering from a serious illness and in no position to fight a prolonged legal battle. By the time my father understood what had happened to him, the paperwork was signed, the company had been renamed simply Halverson Group, and the man who'd built half of it with his own hands walked away with a fraction of what it was worth, and instructions from his own lawyer that fighting it further would cost more than he had left to spend. My father never fully recovered from that loss. Not financially. We managed eventually. But something in him stayed quietly broken for the rest of his life. He died when I was 26, and the last real conversation we had about the company was him telling me, without bitterness, strangely, that he hoped someday the truth would matter to someone besides him. I decided it would matter to me. I want to be honest about something before I go further. What I did next wasn't purely about revenge, though I understand if it sounds that way. It was about understanding. I needed to see, with my own eyes over enough time, whether the man now running my father's company was simply the beneficiary of his father's dishonesty, or whether he was continuing it in his own way. I legally changed my name back to my mother's maiden name, Bennett, a name with no public connection to the Whitfield history that Arthur Halverson had spent decades making sure was forgotten. I built a clean, unremarkable resume. I applied for an administrative position at Halverson Group, the same company that had once belonged half to my father 12 years ago, when Richard had just taken over from his aging father as CEO. I got the job as executive assistant to Richard Halverson himself. I want to tell you honestly that for the first several years, I mostly just watched and did my job well, because I genuinely didn't know yet what I intended to do with what I was learning. Richard, in those early years, was different from what I expected. Not cruel exactly, just profoundly unaware of his own privilege in a way that reminded me constantly of exactly how my father had lost everything. He talked about the company's founding story in investor meetings using language that credited his father's vision almost entirely, occasionally mentioning an early partner who didn't work out, when my father's name came up at all. I sat in those meetings, taking notes, refilling water glasses, watching Richard build an entire mythology around a company that existed, structurally and financially. Because of work my father had done just as much as Arthur Halverson had, I stayed 12 years. I want to be honest that part of staying that long wasn't strategy. It became, at some point, simply my life. I was good at my job. I understood the company's operations better than almost anyone besides Richard himself, because unlike him, I actually read every document that crossed my desk. That habit, reading everything carefully, understanding the structural history of the company down to old shareholder agreements from decades ago, is how I found something. In year 4, that changed everything, buried in an old digitized archive of documents from the company's original incorporation, filed away and clearly never revisited by anyone in decades, was a clause from the original 1980s partnership agreement between my father and Arthur Halverson. A clause that had never been properly dissolved, even after the forced buyout. It was a founder's continuity provision, an unusual, old-fashioned clause some early partnerships included, granting a small but real equity stake, 4%, to any direct descendant of an original founder who later became employed by the company in good standing for a continuous period of 10 years or more. Arthur Halverson's lawyers, decades earlier, had clearly focused entirely on forcing my father out and securing his shares. Nobody had ever thought to formally strip this specific clause from the company's founding documents, likely because nobody imagined a Whitfield descendant would ever quietly become an employee again under a different name. Without anyone realizing it, I had, at that point, already worked there for 4 years. 6 years later, I would cross the 10-year threshold entirely unnoticed. I didn't act on this immediately. I want to be honest that I spent nearly 2 years after discovering it consulting quietly, carefully, with an attorney outside my usual professional circles, someone with no connection to Halverson Group, to confirm the clause was actually still legally enforceable, rather than simply an old artifact of outdated paperwork. It was enforceable. My attorney was clear about that, and equally clear that acting on it required patience. I needed to complete the full 10 years of continuous employment, and I needed documented proof of my lineage, ready and airtight. For the exact moment it would matter most, I kept working. I kept refilling water glasses. I kept listening to Richard tell the story of a company his father built essentially alone. The acquisition offer came in my 11th year. A much larger logistics conglomerate wanted to buy 80% of Halverson Group for $30 million. Structured as a share purchase requiring signatures from every documented equity holder as part of the closing conditions, a standard requirement any competent acquiring firm's legal team would insist on for a clean transaction. I built the entire due diligence package myself, the same way I'd built countless documents for Richard over the years. Because he trusted me completely with operational details he considered beneath his own attention, I organized every founding document, every shareholder record, every piece of the company's structural history, into the data room the acquiring firm's lawyers would review. I made sure this time that the founder's continuity provision was included in that data room exactly as written, unaltered, and accurately reflecting that I had, 3 months earlier, quietly crossed my 10th year of continuous employment. The room where Richard dismissed me, "She's just my secretary," was the acquiring firm's first full due diligence meeting. One of their senior counsel, a sharp, methodical woman named Patricia Vance, had been reviewing the founding documents personally and asked, almost as an aside, who exactly held the 4% equity position referenced in a decades-old but technically still valid clause. Richard didn't know the clause existed. He'd never read the original 1980s incorporation paperwork closely. Why would he, when the company had operated under his father's, then his own, unquestioned authority for 30 years? He simply assumed it was some outdated artifact of no real consequence, and gestured toward me to go find whatever administrative detail was needed to answer the question. Since I handled all the paperwork, Patricia Vance looked directly at me and asked, "Are you the Claire Bennett listed as the qualifying descendant employee on this provision?" I said yes. The room went very quiet. Richard's confusion in that moment was almost complete. He genuinely had no framework yet for understanding what was happening, because he'd never once considered that his executive assistant of 12 years might be connected to anything beyond fetching his coffee and managing his calendar. Patricia asked a natural follow-up question. Descendant of which original founder? I answered honestly, for the first time in 12 years, using the name I'd been born with rather than the one I'd built my second life around. Edmund Whitfield. He was my father. I want you to understand what that answer actually did in that room. It meant the acquisition, as currently structured, could not legally close without my signature and my formal consent as a qualifying equity holder. A fact the acquiring firm's own lawyers now understood with total clarity, and a fact that meant 30 years of Halverson family mythology about a company built by one visionary man had just cracked, open in front of 6 outside lawyers who had absolutely no loyalty to protecting that story. Richard tried, in the following days, to argue the clause was obsolete, unenforceable, a clerical artifact from a bygone partnership structure. My attorney, the one I'd quietly consulted for 2 years, was ready with documentation showing the clause had never been formally dissolved, and that my employment records, verified independently by the acquiring firm's own HR audit, clearly established the required 10 continuous years. The acquiring firm, increasingly uncomfortable with a founder narrative that now looked considerably murkier than Richard had ever disclosed, insisted the matter be resolved cleanly before they would proceed at any valuation. Richard called me into his office alone 4 days after that meeting. I want to be honest that some part of me expected anger, and there was some of that. But mostly what I saw, sitting across from him for the first time in 12 years as something other than his assistant, was a man beginning to understand a version of his own family history he had never once had reason to question. "Is it true?" he asked quietly. "Your father, he was actually part of building this. I told him everything then. The original partnership, the manufactured crisis, the forced buyout during his illness, the 30 years of silence I'd carried, and the 12 years I'd spent inside his company, watching, waiting, understanding exactly what had been taken and from whom." Richard didn't defend his father. I think somewhere underneath his shock, some part of him had always sensed the founding story didn't fully add up. He simply sat there for a long moment, and then said the only thing that actually mattered to me in that conversation. "I didn't know." I need you to know that. I genuinely didn't know. The settlement, once negotiated with both my attorney and the acquiring firm's counsel present, wasn't structured as a simple payout. My 4% equity stake, at the deal's actual $30 million valuation, came to $1.2 million, but more importantly to me, the acquiring firm required, as a condition of closing it all, a formal, documented, and public acknowledgement within the deal's official history that Edmund Whitfield had been an original co-founder of the company, with his contribution restored to the company's official record for the first time in 30 years. Richard didn't fight that condition. I think in his own way he understood it mattered more than the money. I still work at Halverson Group, though not as anyone's secretary anymore. Part of the settlement included a board advisory position, one I negotiated for myself specifically, so I could ensure my father's history stayed accurately recorded going forward, rather than simply collecting a payout and walking away from the place he'd spent the best years of his life building. I think about him often, especially in that boardroom, sitting in a seat that technically should have belonged to him 30 years earlier. I don't know if the version of justice I found is the version he would have wanted, but I know he spent his last years hoping the truth would matter to someone. It mattered to me. And eventually, in that quiet, unglamorous way truth sometimes takes 30 years to arrive, it mattered to the 6 lawyers in that room too. If you've made it this far with me, do you think Richard genuinely didn't know what his father did? Or do you think some part of him always suspected? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if stories like this one matter to you, make sure you're subscribed to Justice Unfolds, because every story here has a reckoning.